The spotlight was white and merciless. It cut through the darkness of the venue like a surgical blade, pinning him to the stage, exposing every bead of sweat rolling down his forehead, every tremor in his fingers as they gripped the neck of his Stratocaster. 20,000 people screamed his name. But the sound that mattered most that night was the one nobody heard, the sound inside his chest. A tightening, a fracture forming somewhere between the man and the myth. And what happened next would become one of the most misunderstood moments in rock history. But to understand that night, you have to understand what had been building for months before it. By late 1968, Jimi Hendrix was no longer simply a musician. He had become a phenomenon, an industry, a brand that consumed more energy than any single human being could reasonably sustain. Yet the Jimi Hendrix Experience had spent the better part of 2 years on a relentless touring schedule that crisscrossed the United States, Europe, and beyond. Biographies and archival accounts from that period describe a pace that would have broken most artists. Sometimes 2 shows in a single day, separated by hours of travel in cramped vehicles, followed by hotel rooms that all looked the same, in cities that blurred together into one long, exhausting corridor of noise and obligation. The albums were selling. The concerts were selling out. The posters, the merchandise, the television appearances, everything was moving at a velocity that left no room for the one thing Jimi needed most. Silence. Time to think. Space to breathe and remember why he had picked up a guitar in the first place. But there was a problem that went deeper than exhaustion. A contradiction had taken root at the center of his career, and it was growing more painful with every performance. The audiences that filled those arenas, the fans who screamed and pushed toward the stage, they were not coming to hear music. They were coming to see a spectacle. They wanted the teeth on the strings. They wanted the guitar played behind his head, between his legs with his tongue. They wanted fire. They wanted destruction. They wanted the wild man, the shaman, the psychedelic warrior who turned amplifiers into weapons and stages into battlefields. And Jimi had given them exactly that. He had built this image himself, performance by performance. From the early London club shows where he first learned that setting a guitar on fire got more attention than playing it beautifully. The problem was that he had become too good at it. The spectacle had swallowed the substance. The trick had consumed the truth. What most people did not know, what the screaming crowds and breathless journalists and eager promoters could not see, was that Jimi Hendrix was evolving. Inside the chaos of touring and fame, he was quietly becoming a different musician. His private recordings from this period, the tapes he made alone in studios after everyone else had gone home, reveal an artist reaching toward something far more complex and nuanced than what he was allowed to present on stage. He was experimenting with jazz structures, layering orchestral textures, exploring rhythmic ideas borrowed from West African traditions and Indian classical music. He was writing songs that had nothing to do with psychedelic showmanship and everything to do with the deeper possibilities of sound itself. But none of that mattered when the lights came on and 20,000 people started chanting for tricks. The friction between these 2 versions of himself, the performer they demanded, and the artist he was becoming, created a tension that those close to him could feel intensifying week by week. According to accounts from band members and crew, Jimi had started arriving at sound checks earlier than anyone else, spending long stretches alone with his guitar, playing material that bore no resemblance to the set lists his management had approved. He would work through complex chord progressions, and sometimes stopping mid-phrase to scribble notes on scraps of paper, hotel stationery, napkins, anything within reach. Then the doors would open, the crowd would pour in, and everything he had been exploring in private would be locked away in favor of the performance they expected. There was also the matter of his management. Documented accounts describe a business relationship that had grown increasingly controlling. The touring schedule was not designed around Jimi's creative needs. It was designed around revenue. Every night off was a night of lost income. Every experimental studio session that did not produce a commercially viable single was viewed as wasted time and money. The pressure to deliver the product, The Jimi Hendrix experience as a reliable commercial engine collided constantly with his desire to grow, to change, to become something the market had not yet imagined. He was caught between the machinery that sustained his career and the artistic instincts that made his career worth sustaining in the first place. And then there were the audiences themselves. Not all of them, but enough of them to make the pattern impossible to ignore. At show after show during this period, Jimi would attempt to introduce new material, to share the music he was most excited about, the compositions that represented where he was heading as an artist, and the response was almost always the same: restlessness, scattered conversation, people drifting toward the exits to buy drinks or use the facilities, only to rush back the moment they heard the opening notes of a familiar hit. The message was unmistakable. They did not want to hear where he was going. They wanted to hear where he had already been. Biographies describe a particular evening during this period that crystallized everything. The venue was packed. The energy was electric in the conventional sense, that buzzing anticipation that fills an arena before a major act takes the stage. Jimi and the band walked out under the lights and began with a new piece he had been developing, a slow-building composition that layered guitar textures over a shifting rhythmic foundation, something closer to jazz than rock, something that required patience and attention to fully appreciate. The audience tolerated it for perhaps 90 seconds before the chanting began. Quiet at first, then building. The name of his most famous song. Over and over, not a request, a demand. Jimi kept playing the new piece. His eyes were closed. His fingers moved across the fretboard with the precision and care of someone who believed deeply in what he was creating. But the chanting grew louder. It became a wall of sound that competed with the music itself, that made it impossible for anyone in the venue to actually hear the subtleties of what he was offering. The crowd was not hostile. They loved him. That was the cruelty of it. They loved the version of him that no longer existed, and their love was loud enough to drown out the version he was trying to become. Something shifted in his body language. The people closest to the stage would have seen it. A slight stiffening of the shoulders. A change in the way he held the guitar, pulling it closer to his body as if protecting something fragile from a storm. He opened his eyes and looked out at the sea of faces. 20,000 people who had paid money and traveled distances and waited in lines to see Jimi Hendrix, and not one of them was listening. He finished the new piece. There was polite applause. Then the chanting resumed, louder than before. The band looked at each other. The set list was right there, taped to the stage floor, a carefully arranged sequence of familiar hits designed to maximize crowd response and minimize risk. The safe path, the expected path, the path that would satisfy everyone except the one person who mattered most. What happened next has been described differently by different witnesses. Some remember it as sudden. Others say it built gradually. But the accounts converge on the essential truth. Jimi launched into one of his most famous songs, and for the first few minutes, everything was exactly what the crowd wanted. The familiar riff, the familiar energy, the familiar spectacle of a man seemingly possessed by his instrument. The audience erupted. This was what they had come for. This was the product performing as advertised. But somewhere in the middle of the song, a door opened that could not be closed. Jimi began pushing the tempo faster. The dynamics grew more aggressive. His playing took on an edge that went beyond performance, beyond showmanship, beyond anything in the rehearsed arrangement. He started attacking the strings with a ferocity that made his bandmates exchange worried glances. The sound coming through the amplifiers was no longer music in any conventional sense. It was something raw, something that lived in the space between expression and explosion. The guitar became a conduit for everything he could not say. The frustration of being reduced to a brand, the loneliness of hotel rooms in cities he would never remember, the exhaustion of smiling for cameras when every muscle in his body ached for rest, the grief of watching his own artistic evolution be rejected in real time by the people who claimed to love him most, the rage of being owned, scheduled, marketed, packaged, sold. Everything that had been building for months found its way into his hands, through his fingers, into the trembling body of the Stratocaster that had been his closest companion through all of it. And then he started smashing the guitar. The crowd went insane. This was the climax they craved. The destruction, the chaos. The rock and roll mythology made flesh right before their eyes. As they screamed with delight as the guitar hit the stage, they cheered as he picked it up and brought it down again. They roared as splinters flew and strings snapped and the amplifier howled with feedback that sounded like something dying. But the people backstage saw something the audience could not see. They saw that Jimi was not performing. His face was not the face of a showman delivering a calculated spectacle. It was the face of someone in genuine anguish. His eyes were not wild with rock star energy. They were wet. His jaw was clenched so tight that the muscles in his neck stood out like cables. And he was not stopping. Long after the theatrical destruction should have ended, long after the crowd had gotten its money's worth of chaos, he kept going, bringing the broken guitar down on the stage again and again and again, and each impact carrying less sound and more desperation, as if he were trying to destroy not just an instrument, but the cage it represented. The roadies exchanged nervous glances. The band had stopped playing. The crowd was still cheering, but the cheering had taken on an uncertain quality, the way laughter changes when a joke goes on too long and people begin to wonder if they are still watching comedy. The stage manager was standing in the wings, frozen, unsure whether to intervene or let it run its course. Nobody had a protocol for this. There was no page in the production manual that covered the moment when a performer's mask crumbles in front of 20,000 witnesses who cannot tell the difference between art and agony. Finally, he stopped. Not because he had decided to stop, but because there was nothing left to destroy. The guitar was unrecognizable. Pieces of wood and metal scattered across the stage like debris from a small disaster. The amplifier buzzed and crackled, processing the ghost of the last impact. Jimi stood in the center of the wreckage, chest heaving, hands hanging at his sides. The crowd gave him a standing ovation. He walked off stage without acknowledging them. Backstage, according to multiple accounts from crew members and associates present that night, the atmosphere was unlike anything they had experienced before or after. Jimi walked past everyone without speaking. He found a small room, a storage area, or dressing room depending on the account, and sat down alone. When someone checked on him a few minutes later, he was sitting perfectly still with his hands in his lap, staring at the floor. His hands were bleeding. Not dramatically, not in the rock mythology sense of noble wounds earned in battle, but in the quiet, painful way that happens when skin meets broken wood and twisted metal repeatedly without the protection of awareness. He had not noticed, or he had not cared. Someone brought him a towel and a drink. He took the towel. He did not take the drink. He sat there for a long time without talking. The noise of the venue continued outside, the crowd filing out, the conversations and laughter and car engines that marked the end of another successful show. Because from the audience's perspective, the show had been spectacular. The destruction was the highlight. Tomorrow's newspapers would celebrate it. The promoters would count their money and plan the next date. But in that small room behind the stage, something had broken that could not be repaired with new strings or a replacement instrument. The distance between who he was and who they wanted him to be had finally become unbearable, and the guitar had absorbed the cost of that contradiction. A member of the road crew, speaking decades later to a music publication, described what he saw that night with a simple clarity that no amount of rock criticism has improved upon. He said that for the first time in all the months he had worked with Jimi, he saw a man who looked like he wanted to quit. Not quit playing music, just quit being Jimi Hendrix. The image, the expectation, the relentless demand to perform a version of himself that no longer fit. The weight of a legend that had been constructed on top of a human being who was still, underneath all of it, just a 25-year-old trying to figure out what his music was supposed to mean. The days following that concert revealed the depth of what had happened. According to biographical accounts, Jimi became increasingly withdrawn. He showed up for the next few shows, played the set lists, delivered the performance that was expected, but something had dimmed. The fire, the genuine fire that had once lived in his playing, the joy and curiosity and reckless exploration that had made him extraordinary, it was harder to find. In its place was a professionalism that looked, from the outside, exactly like passion but felt, to those who knew him, like obligation. He spent more time alone in studios during this period. Sometimes he would book time at 3 or 4 in the morning, when the building was empty and the city was quiet, and play for hours without recording anything, just playing, searching for something in the sound that the touring schedule and the audience demands, and the management pressure had made almost impossible to reach during normal hours. The engineers who occasionally worked these sessions described a musician who seemed to be having a private conversation with his instrument, working through ideas that were years ahead of what the market was prepared to accept. It was during one of these late-night sessions that he reportedly said something that captures the entire contradiction of his position. Speaking to an engineer who had stayed late to help him experiment with a new recording technique, Jimi said, quietly and without apparent self-pity, that sometimes he felt like he was two people. One of them stood on stage and gave the audience what they wanted. The other one sat alone in rooms like this and tried to find the music that actually mattered. And the first one was slowly killing the second one. The engineer did not know how to respond. What do you say to the most celebrated guitarist on the planet when he tells you that his own fame is consuming the thing that made him worth celebrating? The paradox had no solution that anyone could offer from the outside. The audiences would not change. The industry would not change. The only variable in the equation was Jimi himself, and he was running out of ways to bend without breaking. The guitar-smashing incident was not isolated. Similar moments occurred at other concerts during this period, though none with quite the same intensity. Biographies and contemporary accounts describe performances where the destruction felt less like theater and more like therapy, where the violence directed at the instrument seemed disproportionate to any showmanship purpose, where the people backstage whispered to each other afterward with a concern that went beyond professional worry about damaged equipment and entered the territory of genuine human alarm. But here is the detail that makes this story more than just another rock and roll tragedy. Jimi did not surrender. The frustration, the exhaustion, the crushing weight of being an icon instead of an artist, none of it extinguished the creative drive that had brought him to music in the first place. In the months that followed, he threw himself into building Electric Lady Studios, a space designed entirely around his vision. A place where the walls were curved to affect acoustics, where the lighting could be adjusted to match his mood, where no promoter or manager or screaming audience could intrude on the process of making music that mattered. Electric Lady was not just a recording studio. It was a declaration of independence, a physical space that embodied the principle that art should serve the artist, not the market. Every design decision, from the custom mixing console to the ambient lighting, to the isolation booths configured for his specific recording technique, reflected a mind that had thought deeply about what was wrong with his creative environment and had decided to build a better one from scratch. The people who worked with him at Electric Lady during its final construction phases and earliest sessions describe a different Jimi than the one who had smashed his guitar in frustration on that stage. Not happier, exactly, but more focused, more present, more connected to the music and less consumed by the performance of being a rock star. The studio gave him something the stage could not: control, not over other people, but over his own creative process. The freedom to play a piece 20 times until it sounded right. The space to experiment without an audience judging every note against their expectations. He was working on material that defied every category the music industry had created. Compositions that blended rock instrumentation with jazz harmony, funk rhythms with orchestral arrangements, wah blues feeling with electronic experimentation. The recordings from this period that survived and were eventually released reveal an artist who was operating at the very edge of what popular music could accommodate. Not breaking rules for the sake of rebellion, but expanding the language of the electric guitar in directions that other musicians would spend decades trying to follow. But time was not generous with Jimi Hendrix. The calendar that had been his enemy throughout his career, the relentless schedule that left no room for the artist to breathe, continued to apply its pressure. Even as Electric Lady Studios neared completion, there were touring obligations to fulfill, contractual commitments that could not be ignored, a machinery of commerce that did not pause for creative evolution. The tension between the studio and the stage, between the musician he was becoming and the performer they still demanded, remained unresolved. What makes the guitar smashing incident resonate decades later is not the destruction itself. Instruments have been broken on stages before and since, usually as carefully choreographed theater designed to create exactly the kind of excitement that sells tickets and generates headlines. What makes this moment different is the authenticity of the anguish behind it. The fact that what looked like rock and roll bravado was actually a cry of artistic suffocation. The fact that the audience cheered loudest at the exact moment the performer was in the most pain. The fact that nobody in that building, except perhaps a few crew members standing in the wings, understood what they were actually witnessing. There is something deeply uncomfortable in that image. A man pouring genuine suffering into a public act, and the public interpreting it as entertainment. It raises questions about the relationship between artists and audiences that remain relevant far beyond the context of 1960s rock music. How much of what we celebrate as creative intensity is actually creative desperation? How often the performances we admire most are the ones that cost the performer the most? How easily we confuse passion with pain when the stage lights are bright enough to blur the distinction. Jimi Hendrix did not smash his guitar that night because it was part of the show. He smashed it because the distance between who he was and who the world demanded he be had become physically unbearable. And the guitar was the only object in the universe that could absorb that much anger and grief and frustration without breaking him in the process. Except, of course, the guitar did break, and that was the point. Something had to. The people who were there backstage, who saw the bleeding hands and the empty stare and the silence that was louder than any amplifier, they understood something that the audience and the press and the history books would take decades to recognize. That the most explosive performance they had ever witnessed was not a celebration of rock and roll excess. It was a warning, a signal flare from an artist drowning in the gap between what he had created and what he had become. And the saddest part, the detail that makes this story linger in the memory long after the facts have faded, is that the audience loved it. They gave him a standing ovation for the most painful moment of his professional life. They cheered for the destruction because they could not see past the spectacle to the human being inside it. They went home and told their friends about the incredible show. How Jimi Hendrix went crazy on stage. How he destroyed his guitar like a madman. How it was the best concert they had ever seen. They never knew. They were watching a man break. And they thought it was the show. And maybe that is the real lesson buried in the wreckage of that night. That genius does not protect you from loneliness. That fame does not equal understanding. That sometimes the loudest performances come from the quietest suffering. And that the distance between applause and empathy can be the loneliest space in the world. In the years that followed, long after Jimi was gone, the people who had been backstage that night carried the memory differently than the audience did. They did not talk about it as a great show. They talked about it as a turning point. The night they realized that the person they were working with was not indestructible. The night the myth became human again, if only for a few minutes, in a small room behind a stage where the cheering still echoed through the walls like something that did not know when to stop. Jimi Hendrix left behind a body of recorded work that continues to reshape how musicians think about the electric guitar, about sound, about the relationship between technology and emotion. But he also left behind moments like this one. Moments that remind us that every icon was first a person, that every legend carries weight, and that sometimes the most important thing happening on a stage is the one thing the audience cannot see. What would have happened if someone in that crowd had listened instead of cheered? What would have changed if the ovation had been silence instead, a 20,000-person acknowledgement that something real was happening, something that deserved attention instead of celebration? We will never know. But the question itself is worth asking, because somewhere, right now, in a venue you have never heard of, another artist is standing under the lights, giving everything they have, and the audience is applauding for all the wrong reasons. And maybe the only thing that can change that pattern is the willingness to look past the performance and see the person, before the guitar breaks, before the silence comes, before the only sound left is the echo of what we should have understood all along,